Hey, this is the a joint meeting of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force for the League of Women Voters of Colorado. And it's also with the News Access and Literacy Task Force. So we're really lucky today. We have two great speakers. We have Margie Thompson, who's a professor emeriti at University of Denver, and she specializes in multicultural and global journalism and media. And then we also have Dave Perry, who's the publisher and an editor of the Aurora Sentinel. And Dave is an independent journalist who is on the forefront of the disinformation concerning immigrants in Aurora. So this is a really exciting presentation. We're glad you're all here. And I'll turn it over to Margie to start and give a little bit of background on what misinformation and disinformation is. Shauna's going to introduce Margie right now. Shauna Tracy.
Buddy, thank you so much for coming, for being, invested in immigration. I'm going to just jump right in because we have a big group and lots to discuss, lots to talk about. Dr. Margie Thompson, as Kathy said, is a professor emerita in media, film, and journalism studies at DU. She also founded the graduate program in international and intercultural communication. Dr. Thompson became involved in Latin American social justice and immigrant rights groups in the Denver area. She serves as a volunteer with the Denver Justice and Peace Committee, the Denver Metro Sanctuary Coalition, Sanctuary for All, the American Friends Service Committee, the Colorado Migrant Family Program, was a member of the DU Immigrant Rights Forum, the Immigrant Workshop Series Planning Committee, and the Migra Hack Committee. She also volunteers with CIRC, which is the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, to document stories of undocumented immigrants and their families who are fighting deportation. Through these connections, Dr. Thompson has continued to partner with Indigenous and undocumented women in order to bring their stories to light through independent journalism. We are very privileged to welcome to our J.E.D.I meeting tonight, Dr. Margie Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Shauna and Kathy and the League of Women Voters for inviting me to thank the task force and so on. I am very glad to be here. This topic, I think, is so important and so timely. I think that it's very important to be talking about this, and especially given what happened yesterday with the inauguration of Trump. And I understand that the mass deportations have started. A friend of a friend said that in Denver that there were ICE officials outside of schools and were following kids home because they can't go they can't go inside the school. So it's very scary, and I think very important to look at what kind of information we're getting. The images here show you that there's some very different perspectives on immigrants and immigration, and a lot of conflict and controversy. So I want to talk about what are those dynamics and how does that happen. So Kathy, if you go to the next. This is an example of the kind of mis and disinformation that we see around Aurora, which Dave is going to talk more about. But basically, there was enormous controversy around Venezuelan immigrants and gangs, and the whole thing was blown up and was mostly untrue. And this is social media, and this is the kind of thing that gets shared and circulates so much, and these very sensationalist kinds of things. And you can see these are from news sources you probably never heard of. I hadn't either. But this is the kind of thing that is circulating. Next slide.
There we go. I covered over the box.
So misinformation is information that is inaccurate and is often poorly sourced, where the source is vague or doesn't really have the credentials to be a credible source, and so on. But it's created and distributed not necessarily with the intention to manipulate, whereas disinformation is deliberately created and distributed to manipulate, to generate fear and panic. And so is very often inaccurate, often has conspiracy theories. You saw the previous slide and so on. And it's really designed to generate, to encourage people to share it and so on. And it creates this panic and so on. And I would say that these kinds of things are a big factor in why Trump was reelected and why immigration has shifted to the right, even with the Democrats, in terms of cracking down on immigration and ignoring the fact that, these are human beings who just want to live their lives and are often escaping horrendous violence and so on in their own countries. So this misinformation and disinformation contributes to creating this very controversial and heated environment. Next one. And click again, please. So these are examples of headlines, and they're the kinds of things you've probably seen a lot. The first is with Fox News. It was actually from yesterday, where Trump is declaring, you can see, it says national emergency, so it's a sort of sensationalist thing. Trump declares ambitious illegal immigration crackdown. So it's sort of this, isn't he great? Kind of this crackdown tough guy in inaugural address. And that's very different from this other headline, which is from an alternative source in California, what's going to happen to my kids? So it really focuses on the human side of all that's going on. If you would click again, please. So there are some terms that I think are useful here. Would you click again, please? So agenda setting is what is on the media agenda, and then what becomes on what is on people's agenda as far as important issues. So immigration obviously has been covered a lot, and you see it in a lot of the media agenda. We saw a lot of coverage, especially during the elections and so on. But framing is how it's presented. So you can have the same issue, but present it in very different ways that reflects a bias. So you can see with these two headlines how, yes, they're both about immigration, but they are framed in very different ways, which shapes how people see the issue. Click again, please. And agenda hacking is where you can see it by the right wing with immigration, where they flood the media sphere with sensationalist news and negative news about immigrants, and basically hacks the agenda with very negative views of immigration and a lot of, generating fear and panic. And again, please. And one of the things that contributes to this creating such division and conflict are what are called echo chambers. And this is with social media, where the social media that we see is often the kind of thing we agree with. And we share and we see what we agree with in terms of our opinions and attitudes and so on. And the algorithms track what it is we're looking at, and then what we share and so on. So it ends up with people seeing mainly the kind of stuff that they agree with and that fit their views. So they don't see other alternative perspectives. So, questions about why would people support Trump when he was, a convicted felon and so on. I think these echo chambers help explain that, as well as, something like Fox News, which, basically ignored or played down his the negative information about him. And one more.
Excuse me, could we have everybody please mute? Go ahead.
So click again, please. So another thing that contributes to this is what's called confirmation bias, where people generally pay more attention and agree with things that are already fit their attitudes and so on. So if you're talking about, general racism and xenophobia around immigrants, And people who have those views, then confirmation bias is such that, I'm going to pay more attention to that. I'm going to share that, and that will be part of my echo chamber. So go ahead to the next. Again. Yes. So the question is, where does this disinformation come from? And a lot of it originates in underground kind of fringe channels like blogs, social media platforms, amateur media websites, and so on. You click again. And a lot of it is fake or is false, and it's created by what are called bot farms, which are kind of networks of web and telecommunications kinds of things. And these can be positive in that, many companies and organizations contract with bot farms to create web content, to monitor their social media and so on. But at the same time, they also are instrumental in creating fake websites, fake Facebook accounts, and Instagram and so on, using artificial intelligence. So we saw this in the 2016, 2020, and 2024 elections. 2016, for example, and later, there were a lot of bot farms out of Russia that were producing all of this disinformation, and then distributing it, and depending on the kinds of dynamics I just talked about. There have also been bot farms coming out of Macedonia, out of the Ukraine. A lot of bot farms produced information that was anti-Russian, et cetera, and certainly bot farms in the US.
Well, when we took steps to make it harder to enroll in the NCAA and then Medicaid less generous.
So we're also seeing it in mainstream media where they pick up these narratives. Can you click twice more, please? So Fox News certainly is spreading disinformation.
Margie, wait. Margie, we have you on mute just a minute up. Can you unmute? Margie.
So was I muted the whole time?
Yeah, just since sorry about that.
Okay. So the mainstream media has also picked up on a lot of these kind of negative narratives around immigration, with Fox News, for example, where, as I said, they bring on guests who tell all of these lies. So it isn't like Fox News is the commentators, but often they're also presenting disinformation and so on. But also other mainstream media. We saw, we've seen these same kind of narratives. Click again, please. So the impact of this is very serious and terrible on immigrant communities, and especially on children. As Shauna mentioned, I've done journalism work, a lot of interviews with undocumented women and children, and they're terrified to go out of the house. The children get hysterical when they see police cars. They're afraid to take their kids to school. They're afraid to call the police when there's a crime. They're afraid to get health care and so on. And so, all of this mis and disinformation contributes to this. You click again. Again. And again. So what it does is, as I said, generate fear and panic, and it stigmatizes the community with stereotypes that are perpetuated and reinforced. The panel that Kathy mentioned that I was on with the Rocky Mountain Welcome Center for Immigrants and Refugees, it was me, and then it was 3 Venezuelan immigrants. And they talked about the impact of all of this mis and disinformation. And one of them is a mechanic, and he had a workshop, and the owner of the building kicked him out, saying that he was no doubt in a gang, being Venezuelan, which wasn't true. And then one of the women said she was applying for jobs, but many of the jobs now won't even take her application because she's Venezuelan. So you can see that this has very serious impacts. Go ahead. And policy. We're seeing now that with policy that many states have passed and municipalities have passed policy that really is, condemning and punishing immigrants as criminals, assumptions that they're criminals when immigrants are far less likely to commit crimes than other people. And also in Congress, what's happened. And all of this is, all of this is, I think, fueled by this mis and disinformation. Go ahead. So what are solutions? It's really tough. It's so overwhelming. There's so much of the mis and disinformation out, but there are more and more fact-checking organizations. So these are a couple that you can go to their websites and look at stories that they've identified as having errors and being, false with conspiracy theories and so on. The next one. I also encourage people to talk back to journalists and editors, especially with more credible news sources, to contact them and tell them, when you feel that there's a bias. Although I encourage you to be respectful, because I know that, and I'm sure Dave knows that journalists are besieged with horrendous hate mail and so on, especially women. It's very misogynist, but otherwise too. So if you do talk back, I encourage you to be very respectful and to say something that has content and that is credible. Go ahead. Also, with all of the sensational social media, I think it's best to not respond, to not share it, to not comment, and to just ignore it. Otherwise, again, it contributes to the hype with the media sphere. And the next. And I think one of the most important things is what's called media literacy, which is basically developing critical skills to view media and being able to see, where is the bias, who are the sources, et cetera, et cetera. And there are some of these programs in schools, which I think are really important, and also in colleges. But I think also people can become more aware themselves. And go to the next. This is from one of these fact-checking organizations. And basically, to quickly go over it, if you see a story such as the ones I provided there, to look at the source. And often they'll take something like CNN and it's cnn.org rather than cnn.com in order to pretend that it's from CNN when it's really not. There was a story that circulated during the 2016 elections that the Pope had endorsed Trump. And this was a very good example. And this was shared millions and millions of times, more so than a lot of other stories. And again, the source looked legitimate, but it wasn't. And to look beyond, if it's really outrageous, Google the headline or Google the topic and see if you see it on other sources, and look at the author. And look into, who are the sources in the story? Google the people. Are they credible sources? What are they saying? Do they even have sources? And so on. And look at the date. Often it's old news that's recirculated. Is it a joke? Is it satire? Because that's often, picked up as legitimate news. And then look at your own biases. And are you looking at this from a bias, which I think we all have biases and so on, what impact does that have? And then ask the expert is basically looking at these fact-checking sites. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Margie. We have time for questions right now. I see one question from Shauna. So Shauna, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Margie, I would argue that you could go so far as to say a bill like the Lake and Riley Act could be considered not misinformation or disinformation, but I feel like the title of that bill is so sensationalist. And I think that's a big part of why it passed. And I feel like a lot of senators, Democrats who voted for it just felt like their constituents grasped onto that poor young woman's name, didn't read the bill, and just said this must pass. Am I off base here, or could that count?
So you're referring to the bill that just passed that gives Trump the power to shut down or to remove tax exempt status from organizations and media?
No, the bill that is allows them to detain any immigrant that has been accused of theft, not even convicted, just accused. And then they slapped this Lake and Riley name on it, obviously the young woman who was raped and murdered. And I just feel like, could that be considered sensationalism?
Oh, certainly. I think it feeds into the fear um, that people have. And it shows, you'll see because of the attitudes, the negative attitudes in this confirmation bias that, one immigrant commits a crime, immediately it's all immigrants are criminals and so on. And also how immigrants are really put in a terrible situation where, it's, well, if you do this, you'll be okay. And bam, nope, that's not going to work. Well, if you do this, this will work. Nope, that won't work, and they're boxed in. And so here's another example where they're talking about, will they focus on deporting people, immigrants who committed crimes? Well, what's a crime? If somebody's arrested for drunk driving, they could get deported for that. Whereas someone else who's not an immigrant, wouldn't necessarily get that, and so on. So I think you're right. And I think that this misinformation and disinformation has fueled hysteria by both Republicans and Democrats that something like this would pass. And it's terrible. It's so unfair. And I'm sure that there's a lot of lawsuits and, the ACLU and so on saying that it's really unjust.
And could you go so far as to say, when you say what is a crime? Well, crossing the border, just that, that could immediately qualify you, if
Yeah,
they,
I mean, many immigrants come on a tourist visa and then they overstay the visa. Now, is that a crime? And others cross and they don't have a visa. But, is that a crime? It's just terrible. And it's so arbitrary. I mean, a lot of ICE agents have what's called discretion. And so they can, they had a bad day. Well, then I'm going to slap this person into detention and I'm going to do this and this. It's very arbitrary. And so this kind of thing, what you're talking about, I mean, that's the kind of thing where people can be declared criminals or charged with a crime because one person thinks that they are going to do that. So there's no really very few standards. I mean, the standards are kind of vague depending on where it takes place.
probably intentionally so.
Well, I think the Lake and Riley Act, and Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but it makes it mandatory for anyone accused of theft or accused of violence against a law enforcement officer to be detained and deported. Accused but not convicted.
There apparently is some sense of discretion with this act, but what it does is it promotes the idea that the federal government needs to cooperate with other governments to identify people who are suspected of crime, and that is the key word here. And from what we're hearing from Colorado's two senators, that was their objection to this, that these people have not been adjudicated. And clearly the danger here is by saying if someone is suspected of a crime that they are eligible for deportation, is to encourage people who are anti-immigrant to make false accusations to trigger this act into motion, and then remove people into custody and start the deportation.
Right.
But apparently there is some discretion with this, though, that if a law enforcement official were to be aware of potential crime, that they would have some ability to turn the other way or just disregard any responsibility under the act. It would not be that compelling.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I did not understand that. And I do want to say that the League of Women Voters has a policy that we oppose the mass deportation of people who are in the country now, unless they've been convicted of a major or violent crime. And there's a specific sentence that illegal re-entry is not considered a major crime, according to the League of Women Voters. We have another question here from Dave, and then we'll have to get to Dave with his presentation. Margie, this was fantastic. I think a lot of people really appreciated your comments and telling us exactly what mis and disinformation is. So, Kay, you want to go ahead?
Yes, my question is, since Fox has their own, or the far right has its own network through Fox, what can we do to try to get other stations to come back and give the other thing? I see it sometimes where they respond to something that happens, and I'm seeing now more that there is some correction of it on TV. I'd just like to figure out what can we do to help them encourage that more?
I think contact the stations and write to the producers and the reporters and so on, and encourage them to cover things. I mean, it's part of it is that so much of mainstream corporate media is run by profit and it's money. And they made enormous cuts in staff. With the Denver Post, it's, been huge cuts once they were purchased by a venture capitalist. And so they're having to make very quick decisions. The reporters have enormous workloads and covering several things and so on. But I think to contact the station and encourage them to cover something, or if you feel that, the point of view they presented is
Don't you think as
inaccurate.
the league, though, there's something each of the leagues could do to send out some information about how important it is to give both sides to an issue? Because I just think we need it. I think we're kind of sitting and waiting for it to happen, and then we respond to what happened, and people are like, well, yeah, then they'd respond. I think we need to be proactive, but
Well, I think doing media literacy workshops would be a good idea to raise awareness of people of, what is misinformation, what is disinformation, so they're at least aware of it, because it's so easy to just see a headline and go, oh, wow, what's that? And to just believe it or not really critique it and even share it if it's social media or maybe not. So I think media literacy workshops would be a good way to do that.
Linda, do you want to say anything from the News Access and Literacy group about that?
I do. The League of Women Voters, we have a news literacy page with tools for spotting mis and disinformation that are exactly what Margie was explaining. And I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to hear from Dave Perry, who's the editor of the Aurora Sentinel. Dave's coverage of the Aurora Venezuelan misinformation, disinformation, and his coverage of immigrants in general has just been fantastic. And his paper is independent. And could everybody please mute, please? His paper is independent, and I was very pleased to see him fact-checking the inauguration speech yesterday. So Dave, why don't you go ahead?
I'd like to thank all of you for inviting and hosting, and also especially just for taking this kind of interest in this. This is really heartening for journalists that this many people really care about this topic, but also getting the story straight. And also thanks to Margie, who I wish we could just run that on tape endlessly on Fox News and CNN and help people understand that, how easy it is to be deceived and how frequent it is. And one of the things that she had talked about there that we deal with as an industry of journalists is what we see as being highly irresponsible as journalists. The deceptive practices that Fox News uses are really very insidious. And some of these things we learn very early as journalists. And it's one of the things that Fox News and unfortunately a lot of TV news does right away is they run out with a story where they've got something very controversial And what they do is say, you know, we have heard this thing and we have not yet been able to verify it. And so immediately they're giving credibility to an allegation with absolutely no evidence that supports anything that they're talking about. And Fox News is infamous for this, and this happened especially with the Aurora Venezuelan immigrant and apartment and gang controversies that happened. And the way that they can do this best is by having somebody who appears to be in a credible position to make an allegation, and they feel that that makes it newsworthy and that they should be able to run with it. A lot of journalists, though, here in Colorado, we really don't believe that. And with this story, there were some people who really took the high road with this. Our bar was really high as far as any information that we got, that we wanted to make sure that we could vet it 3 or 4 different ways and help people understand the nuance of what that was. I know Channel 9 also worked really hard to make sure that all of the elements of these stories as they came forward were verifiable and that we reported them accurately, and the Denver Post as well. I think did a really commendable job of repeatedly trying to tell people, here's what we know. This particular story is almost like a textbook case of disinformation, and that's what Margie was pointing out here, is that there was so many things that happened before the story really rolled out in front of the public locally as well as nationally. And it started even more than 2 years ago, but especially 2 years ago when there was a large number of Venezuelan immigrants showing up in the metro area. And there was controversy surrounding that, and in the middle of all kinds of other political controversies happening. What we saw is the bipartisan bickering here in Colorado. People would use this for political gain, not really because I think they were genuinely wanting to see immigrants hurt or promote the story for other nefarious reasons, other than they saw this as something to get the attention of the public and to draw people to one side or the other. So this had been going on for a couple of years before the Venezuelan controversy erupted here in Aurora. And just months before this story erupted, there were rumblings that was going to happen. The federal money that was helping to subsidize people for housing and stuff was running out. There was real frustration with that, and also in Denver. And suddenly the city of Aurora out of nowhere came out with a resolution forbidding the city of Denver and nonprofit organizations from, what their words were, flooding the city of Aurora with Venezuelan immigrants. And the story under that was under the radar, that there was some sense knowing that eventually all of these people who had aggregated in Denver and were hosted there, and that's where the money was being spent, would eventually start to disseminate across the metro area. So the story kind of came and went and nobody really paid any attention to it. Then we started hearing stories in Northwest Aurora that there were these parking lot parties, kind of like rave parties in the middle of the night, that would go till 3 o'clock in the morning. And there were neighbors who were unhappy with that. We looked into this and we actually sent a reporter to observe what was going on there. And it was about what you would expect. It was a whole bunch of young people in their late teens and early 20s that weren't in school and they can't get jobs and they were bored and it was nice outside. And so they congregated in parking lot and drank beer and Diet Coke until 3 o'clock in the morning. And there really wasn't much more that happened than that we could see or from what we'd heard from neighbors. But the word of that started to spread around, that there were large crowds of immigrants gathering in parking lots causing problems. So this was like in May and June. It's kind of died out. And then the story really took off when in June, it was, I think, late June or July, when the Venezuela election was being held. And there was a lot of controversy around that, especially in the Venezuelan and South American community. And it looked like Maduro was going to lose that election. And through some social media hits, all of a sudden, what was a small group of people meeting in the Gardens on Havana shopping center became a huge group of people. And it was kind of a flash mob that had started with, hey, invite so-and-so, hey, they're having a big thing happening over there. And the research that we saw after this that was done by police made it clear that this was not an intentional thing by any means. It really was almost by accident. This huge number of people, 4,000 people, showed up in this parking lot, and they became unruly. And there was trash and urine and feces. And somebody at one point started firing a gun up into the air. And the shop owners were very nervous. It got to be night. The police showed up to monitor this whole thing. And that was where the story really took off, is there was a city council person who was notified about this, and she did exactly what Margie was talking about, is she started getting on social media with some really inflammatory language saying that this shopping center has been overrun by illegal immigrants, and that there is huge danger, and that a police car has been shot at, and there was just a whole string of things that happened. The next day, when we came into the newsroom to try and sort this out, there were just red dash lights going all over the story. And that's where we stood back, and I know several other journalists did, knowing that given the volatility of the topic of immigration and this large number of Venezuelans, that this story really needed to be handled carefully. And so we started fact checking everything we could as quickly as we could, and working with the police so that we were able to tell our readers the best of our ability and the best of police ability what had actually happened that night. And most of it was a lot of hyperbole. At the same time, there were 4,000 people that showed up in a parking lot within just a few hours, and it was amazing, mostly to most people, that it could happen. And there was concern that it might happen again. And, you know, where was this whole thing going to go? Did they live in Aurora? Was there some sense that other crimes were committed? And that started to fizzle a little bit. But at the same time, that's when the 3 notorious apartments here in Aurora, that story started to come to a head. And that particular story, as our research had found out, has actually been cooking for about 2 years here in Aurora. There's a company called CBZ out of New York that owns these 3 properties and many other across the metro area. And they got these properties essentially on the cheap, and with the idea being that they were going to improvement. And they were all pretty much run down at the time. And so the city has followed this through its various departments to help people understand that the condition of the buildings continued to deteriorate, and pretty quickly. At the same time, what we can tell now is that they were working with some of the NGOs to place Venezuelan immigrants inside these buildings and others here in Aurora. But there were a large number that were sent to these buildings. And from what we can tell now is there was not a lot of services that were provided with them or follow-up, even though they weren't abandoned by any means that we could see. It was just a large number of people with a tenuous life, the inability to get jobs. A lot of them still were able to get work permits and didn't have a clear path toward continuing to pay rent. So the apartment owners knew as they were taking these people on that there was a limited time of how well this might work. When they started running out of money or things started going sideways in the apartments, they did not comply with what the city was working on them with. At the same time, after this all came to the public's the forefront for city council and the public, there were city council people who, for whatever reason, and you know, we're not trying to put a label on whether this was for political gain or that this is anti-immigrant sentiment, but they used this story and used the techniques that Margie's talking about here, that they were taking small parts of this and making it very prominent, especially in places like Fox News and local talk radio stations that would excite people or make them fearful for what was happening in an apartment, not understanding that this particular neighborhood has dealt with violence and gang problems easily for 3 decades. You know, there's at one point where the city took the advice of a national expert and actually put Jersey barriers on Alton and Beeler Street, with the idea being that if you kept people from being able to drive through the streets, you would no longer have drive-by shootings. And to this day, those barricades are still there. And that was over 20 years ago. People just thought that this was a little haven for people that didn't have a whole lot of money. And all of a sudden, the Venezuelans had run into this neighborhood and taken it over. And those are the words that councilperson Danielle Jurinsky used herself on numerous occasions. First, that the entire neighborhood and even parts of the city have been taken over. And then as the Sentinel and the Post and Channel 9 showed that that was wholly untrue, that these were very isolated incidents, and using some of the information that Margie was talking about, that somebody would talk about, well, you know, they're immigrants and they commit crimes and they commit crimes against each other. We would show numerous studies that show that crime among immigrants themselves and crimes committed against non-immigrants is actually very low. That's what we were able to do is, as this story moved forward, is continually tell people, this is what we really know, and this is what you're being told, somewhat insidiously, because there's usually a little nugget of truth in some of this, that yes, there was an attack, or yes, there was a video that we all saw that showed people with guns walking up the stairs and walking into an apartment. Immediately it raised questions because they knocked on the door and didn't break in, and somebody allowed them in. Because the first thing that people saw is people with brown skin walking upstairs with guns in an apartment building and then going inside. That was what set this up. Without the context and helping people understand this is what really was going on there, it made it look like everybody in this building was at risk immediately of being shot or being captured by these people. It's a large complex, and what we were able to show is that there was connection between everybody that was involved in that incident, that this was not a random crime by any means. But at that point, the story had moved for weeks and become an international story. So people already had what their own idea of what did or did not happen there. And so we have to come in behind there and just keep telling people, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and this is what actually happened. One of the things that happened during this whole segment of this story, as the history of these apartment buildings came forward, and CBZ management and who was for blame, that their narrative is that the gangs came in and took over these buildings and made it so that they could not keep them clean and safe for the public. The city's narrative on this whole thing was that they had let them run down, and because of the absence of any management or supervision of these buildings, that criminal elements were able to pretty much freely do whatever they wanted. And what we were able to discern from the residents who lived there and the police who spent quite a bit of time trying to sort this out is that they were very isolated incidents, but it was because of the lack of management that some of these people that lived there that were criminals felt at liberty that they were going to be able to get away with some of the things that they did. What happened here locally, and this story repeated itself on several local TV channels and in also the Denver Gazette, is there was a lawyer for CBZ that sent out a letter to the media that outlined what essentially the narrative was coming from CBC, that this had happened, that they had a manager there, and that he was assaulted and by what he felt were Venezuelan immigrants who were gang members. And it was a list of things that they thought were responsible for the deterioration of these 3 buildings. But the way that some of the Denver media relayed the story to their viewers and readers is they called it a investigation. And they said that lawyers, that attorneys for the CBZ, after a lengthy investigation, revealed that, and then they had these allegations that they made of what it was, by calling this an investigation rather than a letter, and not explaining to people that these were lawyers representing the financial interests of the owner, who is essentially doing nothing more than the preamble or opening remarks in a lawsuit. And that's exactly what they were. But by telling people this is an investigation and this is the aha moment, and now you can see what, the several of the people here in Aurora were trying to convince the public is true, then that pushed other media into trying to push against that particular story. And that happened on numerous occasions as the story has developed over the last few months. But those are the kind of techniques that we see that are misinformation, is just the ability to convince the media or to get them to move along with promoting a narrative by using choice words like that. That is something that lends what they're doing a type of credibility that it really doesn't warrant. And there's nothing wrong with their side of the story and saying, well, here's what we think happened and what my client think happened. But what we want to make sure that we're able to do in the media is go through those narratives and claims and fact check them, and then tell the people, here's what they said, here's what we were able to find out. And that's become almost crucial to the story as we move through it. As far as what's happening in the story right now with immigrants, and this is another thing that is really difficult for the media to explain to people. As Trump became elected and started rolling out this narrative of mass deportations, the word of illegal immigrants surfaced again in a new way that we had not quite heard this. And there were several people, even on the Aurora City Council, who were falling behind this new Trump plan, that we needed to get immigrant criminals out of the country. And it really appealed to a lot of people because it just makes sense. It's like, well, if we could get rid of our own criminals, gee, that would be great. If, magic is that they would just go away, it's just so that they don't bother me anymore, without the foresight of understanding there's a lot behind, the criminal justice system and whether or not it's actually effective and, that whether or not that makes us safer. When you learn about it, on the surface, it appeals, saying, well, I don't mind having Venezuelan people who want to work for a living and want to be model immigrants or something like that. However, I don't want people that do home invasions and or rob anybody. That that's an easy choice to make. But where this got conflated most recently is there are people on the Aurora City Council who were supporting a recent resolution saying, we support our immigrant community. However, we understand that there is wisdom in allowing the federal and local government to isolate and deport criminals. And just today, Trump administration is refining that speech to do exactly what Margie was talking about. Is criminal is now defined as someone who is accused of a crime, but they're also defined as someone who has violated immigration law. And that's a 180 of what a lot of people thought was going to happen here, including, in my opinion, when Governor Polis was standing behind this saying, hey, you won't get any pushback from a lot of people who want the government to come in and remove criminal immigrants from the public at large. And now that definition is changing. And I think there's been a lot of misinformation and how that may be moving into disinformation as to what that term actually means and who is going to be subject to federal and local government confrontations and being approached by people, and how we're going to find what's going to happen to residents here who may be completely in compliance until tomorrow if TPS or some other protective temporary sanction is removed. Then people who yesterday were completely here legally and officially and credentialed would no longer be, and would fall into this new zone of being deportable or identifiable. And then another thing that Margie said that is absolutely true is we talk regularly with people who suffer from the fear of what's happening here, the fear of the unknown, as well as what is known, and where it is that they're going to go. And if there are family members, and so there's somebody in school, it's just really put everybody into a lot of consternation here. The thing that we have heard more from anyone that is the fallout from this misinformation and disinformation campaign are people, like you said, that have jobs, that they have work permits, they have jobs, and they either have their hours cut or they have their job position changed so that they do not face the public because of businesses that are fearing that if they see somebody who is brown and speaks with a Spanish accent, that they could be a Venezuelan gangster who would do them no good, and that this will keep people from returning to stores or from choosing their services or something. There's no doubt that there is a spiral down to this type of behavior, and it affects people quickly. What somebody that's a business owner told me is they didn't understand how this was going to roll downhill to them so quickly, is because they decided, well, I've got to protect my business here, so I'm going to put the Venezuelans back in the warehouse, and everybody who works in the front won't be Venezuelan, so I don't have to worry about that. They weren't able to do the job or didn't want to, so they left. Now they're not able to get workers at all already, that there seems to be this shortage of people who are doing this now, that are fearful that if I work for an employer, that may increase my chances of being identified as deportable. And so people are starting to hunker down already. Some of the police officials here over the past few weeks have tried to warn the public, saying you are creating an atmosphere through all of this disinformation that makes people desperate. And so the people who normally would not do anything that could be classified as illegal or nefarious are almost being put in a position where they have no choice but to do something just to survive at this point. And so we're creating the self-fulfilling prophecy by continuing with this narrative that we have to handle immigration in this type of hard-handed and heavy-handed manner, or that we can't move forward as a society. Probably the capper of this whole thing most recently, and this is what we're dealing with right now, is the incident of what police first identified as a home invasion at one of the apartments here. And this is the incident where there was a couple who are Venezuelan immigrants who were living in the Edge of Lowry. And they filmed an incident in the parking lot of their apartment building where there were women and also Venezuelan men who may or may not have been doing something unsavory or illegal. And they posted this video and then also threatened to post it. And at that point, what we now know is that several or a group of people confronted this couple and inside their apartment essentially tried to extract the phone with the video on this thing, and then made threats about their safety and several other things after. But when we first found out about this, what we were told in the media is that the word that they used was a home invasion. And I've written about home invasions a lot, and that narrative and that word is specifically for someone who breaks into someone's home and either kidnaps them or holds them hostage or extorts them some way or another. And that's not what happened. You know, these people were confronted in the parking lot, and from what we were able to find out, they were absolutely, it was extreme and it was horrific what happened to these people. But as the story unfolded, it was not what we thought it was at the beginning. And we were really careful as we went through explaining people what the story was to demand details from the police and explain what some of the words were that they were using and how they might or might not make sense given the facts of the story. What we now know is that that particular incident is now being used saying, see, we told you so. You know, that this building was absolutely overrun by Venezuelan gangsters who were inflicting terror upon other Venezuelan immigrants. And what we now know is that there weren't very many people left in this building, and that even though this was an isolated incident, if you look at this, in that there could be between 10 and 15,000 Venezuelan immigrants in this region of the Metroplex, it helps you understand it, how isolated it is. But being able to push back against inflaming this in the public's eye is a really difficult thing to do. One thing that Margie pointed out too is it's a lack of resources. We don't have a lot of reporter power here. So it takes a lot of dedication to say that we're not going to release a story until we make sure that we get the story right, but also that we have a responsibility to help people understand what they're hearing in other places. It may not be true, or it may not be completely accurate, and to help people understand, you know, please question that. Can I explain anything else about it, or that was a lot? I didn't mean to rattle on like that.
No, that was really, really important to trace it through. So we saw what happened. Dan has a question on, you're on mute. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Here we go.
Oh, there you go.
I am not Dan Moen. I am Mimsy Tackney Moen.
That's what your name is.
She, her, by the way. Anyway, I heard a spot on NPR that said that whoever the person they were interviewing said the Trump administration, and Trump in particular, is calling people illegal and including people who are seeking asylum. And if they're seeking asylum, they're following the procedure they've been told to follow. But now we're getting them all lumped together. Do you know how many of, like, people in those apartment complexes were seeking asylum?
My understanding is the majority of them, you know, that the way that most of these immigrants were handling their immigration into here is to essentially come into the country undocumented and then turn themselves over to immigration officials. At that point, the procedure was to enroll them in a process of putting their immigration status in parole, kind of like the temporary status. And at that point, they have X number of days to further their documentation, to apply for temporary citizenship or whatever it is that their particular need would be. But we haven't been able to talk to everyone, and Margie would know much more about this than I do. But the idea is that immediately you are qualified to apply for and receive a work permit and stay in the United States legally for a certain amount of time to cure your documentation. And there are tens of thousands of not only Venezuelans, but others who are under that same condition that they were. That's why we were so adamant in helping people understand, saying, oh, well, these are legal immigrants and these are illegal immigrants or undocumented. And the vast majority of most of these people that we encountered were documented, that they had documentation from the Department of Homeland Security, and a path forward, even if it is tenuous as it was, to cure that documentation and move forward with applying for either residency or citizenship. And so, but there are also lots of other people that Margie pointed out as well, that come here on a visiting, they're either on a, just straight out visitors, or they come here on a visa for education or for some other reason. They overstay the visa, and then at that point they are undocumented or illegal. And that's a large number of those people that come here one way and stay, build lives, and aren't able to pursue a path to citizenship or residency, legal residency.
Thanks.
Can I just say something?
Please.
I just want to thank Dave for explaining. It's obviously a very complex situation in Aurora, and the way it's been portrayed in a lot of the media is obviously very simplistic and not accurate and so on. But I also want to say to commend Dave. This is what I call top-notch journalism, what they're practicing, where you take the time, you do the research, you say, we're not going to put this out until we know the facts, and then going in and correcting, misperceptions that have been in other media and so on. And, unfortunately, a lot of the big corporate media, people don't have that luxury, but it is a matter of leadership in terms of really pushing for that. So I want to thank you, David. It's so impressive, the work you do.
Thank
Yes,
you.
it really is.
And we are not alone. I have to give kudos to Colorado Public Radio, does an outstanding job, and we work with them on a regular basis on these type of clarification projects. The Colorado Sun also does really good work with helping to ensure that we've all got the straight story. And on this one particularly, I have to give credit to Channel 9 that has taken a lot of heat, just like we have, because of standing solid and saying when there is an allegation and there is no evidence of that we point that out on a regular basis, is that somebody has alleged something without offering any proof or evidence of their claim.
And I think also to seek out, when we're talking about what do we do about this, I think to seek out sources like the Aurora Sentinel, like the other ones you mentioned, that are credible and really do take the time and really do present a balanced point of view, rather than, the stream of headlines you get from Google. It's easy to just skim through and say, oh, that's the news for the day, but to seek out far more credible sources.
Can I ask you one question? This whole idea that immigrants are criminals, it's a big ball and it's rolling down a hill really fast. Is there anything that we as individuals can do to try to stop it?
Well, I think doing this kind of forum that you're doing, I think people you talk to, lost my driver's license a few weeks ago, and I was in the driver's license getting my picture taken, all that. There was an older woman sitting next to me, and we were chatting, and she was very friendly and so on. And there were these two guys that were waiting to get their license, and they were Black, and I would guess African, and she starts snarling about, oh, those illegals, they're, crimes and blah. And I said, they are not able to get a license if they're not here legally, although you can if you're undocumented. But, you know, just the way she muttered, and I said, that's not true, what you're saying. And she said, oh, they probably are just lying and so on. So, I mean, you know, not that I changed her mind, but I think people that you talk to explain, you know, people are not criminals, most are not criminals, etc. And to keep yourself informed and be able to talk about that and talk at forums like this, I think that's really important. And it's a, you know, very slow process. But I think most people really, for example, with the news, most people don't care about politics. Most people really don't care about any of it. So that the sensationalist news is what grabs their attention, and they're saying these things and they really don't know. They don't know that much about it. And so I think, you know, as informed, you know, being informed citizens to really explain to people and find forums where you can speak out in any kind of situation where you're explaining that is not true, or these are the facts, etc.
Thank
You
you.
know, one thing that I have to say that, you know, we are remiss on as far as our industry goes, and especially here in Colorado, and it's because resources are so tight and we are so crisis driven in what we do news wise right now. And so that kind of feeds the fire that everything is a crisis all the time. What we aren't able to do is spend resources in just sharing who these people are, and you know that there are folks who have the best arepa recipes you've ever had in your life. And there are so many things that you can learn in common from just taking the time to talk with and learn about these people, that humanizes them rather than just being someone who is brown, that speaks with an accent or doesn't speak English and becomes unapproachable that way. And that's something that the media can do that really no one else can, is help people understand who we all are with each other and humanize each other. And we're just not able to do that because we don't have the resources. And that's one thing we could do, is provide that information and ask other people to share it. You know, it doesn't have to be long feature stories. If we could just come up with enough resources to do some Instagram reels and TikToks about sharing just that, like tips and tricks that they brought with them from South America, or the, you know, the recipes they've got. One thing that I like to point out to people, and I can do this when I'm writing a column or editorial, is most of these folks walked more than 1,000 miles to get here. These are highly energetic and highly engaged people who are determined, and they did not come here to shoplift. You know, they came here because things were so bad that they were driven. And most of the folks I know complain if they have to walk very far in the parking lot to get to the grocery store. And that kind of a comparison, saying, get to know somebody who would walk 1,000 miles across Mexico and South America just to find a better way to live. Out of 40,000 people, you're probably going to find the vast majority of them are someone that you would love to have as a friend or an acquaintance. But you can't do that unless we can find a way to help people understand here's who they really are and what their life stories are.
I agree, you know, telling the stories and seeking out the stories and so on, because people are, you know, as Dave said, they've come from horrendous situations, and often, you know, they're basically, many are just wanting to come here, raise their kids, send them to school, get jobs, live everyday lives, and to be criminalized for that is, you know, really unfair. But I think seeking out the stories and listening to the stories, I think that's a great way to really help people to see that we're talking about human beings.
Thank you.
One of the funny parts of this story, and there are some humorous things just because it involves people and we got to know the people. There was a TV station that panned across this apartment building in Aurora, and there was a sign in the basement window that was essentially a menu, as if you'd walked up to a food truck and they were selling arepas, arroz con pollo, and the usual things. And the person doing the story is trying to explain that this building is overrun by gangsters who have taken over the building, and they're running a restaurant out of the basement window. And it's like, sign me up, man. I'll join that gang. It's like, if I can go there, and the prices were great. That was the first thing I noticed. It's like, God, you can get tacos for $1. They're $2.50 at the food truck on over here on Havana. It's like, I'm going to North Aurora and getting the real deal for $1. It's like, that's it. Just there's several things like that because folks don't know what's really going on, that they think that this is a way to scare people. And I think most people who could either read a little Spanish or had been to a food truck, it's like, that's not scary.
Well, we've run over a little bit. Shauna, you had a question? Do you still, or?
I know we're over. I just wanted to say really quickly, you know, it's not just media too, because I attended the Douglas County Commissioners meeting last week, and they passed a resolution basically saying Douglas County supports Trump's efforts at mass deportation and that Douglas County would cooperate. And during the presentation of this resolution, there was a lot of talk of the sex trafficking rings in Douglas County, of the increased crime rates in Douglas County, and there's no accountability or checks and balances for what they're saying at all. And there's been nothing in any newspapers about sex trafficking rings in Douglas County. It's very frustrating when even local government officials are putting out this kind of information.
Yeah, and that happened in Aurora too, with the whole invitation for Operation Aurora, and we needed to have this right here, and it's still going on. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for doing this. I mean, this has been really informative, and I think we all appreciate this. Both of you gave such good things that we need to know that that I think it's really helped our members and given us a lot to think about, and a lot. It's not only have the information about what we need to do and how we need to evaluate our news, but also to have a real life example was really, really illuminating. So I really do appreciate this. I do want to mention that next Tuesday at 5:30, we're going to have a program on the DACA program, and the opportunities and challenges it gives to our children who were brought here illegally, our young adults. And if you have any ideas on programs that you'd like to see, and if you have any viewpoint on how often you'd like us to meet, please put that in the chat. So I know you all join me in thanking both Margie and Dave. So thank you very much.
Thank you for including me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't see a lot of suggestions for meetings. Yeah, there was just one woman who brought up let me find it. Lorraine Bowen could address current ice activity in Aurora. I'm not sure who Lorraine Bowen is. Do you know her?
By the evening.
Who was that? No,
Does anybody know?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'll
Uh,
get the chat tomorrow.
yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
much else. All right, thanks. See ya. See you tomorrow.
Okay, bye.